I'm Steve. So I'm moderating this panel, and I'm just going to say a few words about what we're trying to cover here, and then I'll introduce the two panelists, and we'll have a conversation about identity. As Peter's rightly said, identity is a topic that is becoming much more prominent in people's thinking. People realise that it's a pain point in people's lives. Personal data is becoming obviously much more prominent with things like GDPR last year. My perspective is that what we've done in the last 5 years primarily is recognise that it's an issue that we need to deal with. From my perspective, and we'll see what the speakers say, we're a long way from having a real joined-up approach to digital identity, particularly in the UK. Some other places it's different. So anyway, we're going to explore some of these thoughts, and we were having a conversation just earlier about what digital identity is as well, so we might cover that as well. But I wanted to introduce our two speakers. So we have Hussein from, is it Onfido or Onfido?
Onfido.
Onfido. I was right. Excellent. We're having a debate with someone in the lounge. And then Charlie from Comply Advantage. Two successful companies in the space that we're talking about today. So it's great that they're here. Lots of practical experience. And what I thought would be useful first off, I guess some of you will know the companies fairly well, but some maybe not. It'd be useful for them each to introduce perhaps what their companies are, but more importantly, what motivated them to start these companies and why they're in business. Because I think, obviously, if you're going to create a company, then you have to solve a particular issue. So I was to start with you, Hussein. Tell us a bit about the background and why you're doing what you're doing.
Great. Well, it's good to be here. I set up the company 7 years ago now with two co-founders, and our whole impression was that identity is broken and getting worse, and that there needs to be a much better way for people to be able to prove that they are who they claim to be in an increasingly digital world. So the name Onfido in Latin stands as a cross between confidence and trust.
Okay.
That's ultimately what we're looking to build. And so we're embedded into 1,500 or so businesses. 150 of them are enterprise. And as you're registering with any of these companies, it can be an online bank or a car rental company, you are asked to take a photo of your government ID and a photo of your face. And then behind the scenes, we're using machine learning to verify it's a genuine ID and not fake, and that the face matches a photo on there. And as to why we set it up, we have our different reasons as co-founders. But for me, I got first-hand experience of how broken the identity space was when I turned 10. My parents moved to the UK, and I just remember them not being able to open a bank account or rent in their own name just because they weren't registered on this thing called a credit bureau.
Right.
And so growing up, I realized that the credit bureau has historically served an important function, but increasingly seems to be a bit outdated. It's a centralized database that has been breached, and therefore the service and the utility is diminished, given that bad actors can steal your identity relatively easily. So we wanted to find a way of helping businesses access more customers without compromising on security at the same time.
Great. Thank you very much. So I would characterise what the service you provide. I'm introducing some language here which I think will help us with the conversation as we go. I'd characterise that as what we might call explicit identity.
Correct.
In other words, as an individual, it's the steps that I go through to prove who I am. So I show some documents, I give some information about myself, and I'm kind of aware that I'm doing that. It's kind of explicit identity. Charlie, you play a slightly different role in the landscape. So tell us about your company and why you set it up.
So Lendit for me is particularly special because I guess 10 years ago, 2009, I started like a peer-to-peer lending company in the UK called Market Invoice, and we were dispersing and taking millions of pounds in loans from people that we'd never met and giving that money out to other companies. And as well as having the risk of credit defaults, as well, the problem was this whole AML KYC thing. And of all the tasks that I had to do, the one that I hated the most was this kind of AML KYC thing. And so I wanted to kind of start a company that could solve that problem properly. And this is before Onfido, before in the kind of dark times of fintech, right? So it was super early on. So I left Market Invoice 5 years ago, I started with BioVantage, and so I guess we're kind of complementary to Onfido in that whereas Onfido will tell you who is this person, we kind of ask the question, is this person bad? And evil has many dimensions, right, in terms of corruption, terrorism, sanctions violations. So that's the bit we do in the whole spectrum of onboarding.
So in terms of helping us with the conversation, I would then describe what your service is as perhaps implicit identity. What I mean is you're doing things in the background that maybe the individuals who've given you the information about themselves are not directly aware of. So you're looking at data sources, you're looking at lists of lists that demonstrate there might be issues with particular customers, show whether they're good or bad, and so that's implicit. But actually, both of these things have to work together, right? I can say, here's some information that's genuine, that says who I am, but if I've got hold of that fraudulently, then actually there's still a problem. So that you need to have that background, those background processes as well. So the implicit and explicit work hand in hand. So when we think about, so the title for this panel is about an arms race, as Peter said just a minute or two ago. Thinking about what you offer as services and what your customers are asking for, what do you think the main issues are? Where's the problem in financial crime and in identity at the moment? So perhaps take these in turn.
The problem is, so if we take a step back, in our view, identity underpins all transactions, full stop, so that it plays a crucial role. And when you look at some of the most surface level statistics on the identity industry, the first is that half the world's adult population are underbanked or unbanked and therefore not able to access financial services. That's about 2 billion people across the world that want to gain access to either a basic loan or some sort of mortgage or any sort of financial services whatsoever, and they're not able to, just because they're not on a bank and therefore they're not on a credit bureau. And what is equally as bad, maybe even worse, is that the security and the breaches and the amount of money laundering. So the United Nations estimates that up to 5% of the world GDP is laundered money. That's up to $2 trillion every year in laundered money. That's used in human trafficking, drug trafficking, terrorist financing. And the United Nations also estimates that less than 1% of that is seized by authorities. So we have a 99% failure rate in this industry. Which other industry do you know of that is making so much money and yet has a 99% failure rate? So it's excluding so many and yet not offering security. So the problem is bad and getting worse just because businesses have no choice. The regulation, the way the regulators are looking to address this is to increase the fines and increase the barrier for people to gain access. And that's in some parts making it worse. So now you have some banks are locking away some charities and not giving them services, and some countries in Western Africa, again, being completely blacklisted just because there's no effective means to know whether they are who they claim to be or not.
Right, so the banks are, to address the risk issue, are basically excluding
Correct.
vast swathes of their potential customer base, people that need to get access to financial services. Charlie, what's your perspective on this? Where are the big problems? What are the problems today with financial crime?
So I think for me and for the audience, the biggest challenge in running a fintech is the kind of problem around gaining scale. In terms of probably at the start, you have poor unit economics, you're struggling to build a brand, you have to reduce the cost. In order to become profitable, you have to get to try and get to some kind of scale, as in you need millions of customers. And at the start, you might be using an aggregator or a third party for part of your value chain. And therefore, you need to be able to industrially onboard and then monitor scalably millions of customers from all over the world, many of whom you'll never meet or be able to have the cost or revenue to be able to invest in truly understanding. And so if you're, say, onboarding a Saudi investor who's giving you $1 billion, you can afford to fly there and diligence that person. Whereas for me, the kind of interesting spectrum for any fintech is how you scalably administer the bureaucratic process of being able to gain scale and industrialize that process, but not fail in terms of your basic identity and AML checks.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying there is that we have a system that's broken. Clearly it's broken because of the statistics that you just mentioned there, Hussein. And we have we know what some of the solutions to some of those problems are, but the problem at the moment, part of the problem is about how to get adoption and scale of those solutions, because we have people that are used to using their incumbent legacy processes, but they're not, for whatever reason, they're not prepared to buy into new ways of doing things. So maybe we might come back to that a little bit later on in the conversation, because I think it's important that we think about how do we fix the problem we've got today. And so really, at this point, just trying to focus on the problem. So in terms of just thinking about the way things work today in legacy processes, what are some of the fundamental issues with the way that identification or checking that the person's about? What are some of the problems with the way things happen today that result in these horrendous stats?
I mean, I think we as a society haven't figured out how to do this properly yet. As in, 30 years ago, you'd walk into your local bank branch and they probably know you
Yes.
personally, right? Whereas I think in terms of technology, we need to figure out a way to do that remotely, industrially, online, at scale. So I think companies like Onfido are doing a great job of doing that. I think at the same time, as we globalize and as you can move around and as you get the different points of the value chain being cut up and each different lender does a particular segment of the market, then, and as you have new entrants, then you might have 30 companies servicing the same segment, you might have 20 different accounts, none of whom you're actually going to be able to meet, right? So I think fundamentally, in order to function in this new world, which is entirely remote and not face-to-face, we have to figure out a way to do that.
Right, so we have a system that was designed for 10, 15, 20 years ago, but the world's moved on, and the system hasn't. Okay.
So up until only a few years ago, the two fundamental ways of carrying out verifications, first was to see someone face-to-face, but that's not scalable, it's not really convenient, and the alternative is, historically, has been to rely upon centralized credit bureau-based data, which again excludes very many, and because of the breaches, it doesn't offer security.
Yeah.
So this approach of using government IDs and facial biometrics or similar have kind of been more recent. There are small other approaches, knowledge-based questions and things that don't help with convenience and so on. But to get beyond the challenges and move towards something new, there needs to be an agreement on what values and what are the things, the conditions that we all would want to adhere to make that happen.
Yeah.
So the three that we focus on is, one is that whatever the future looks like, it has to be extremely convenient. People don't enjoy talking about identity. The people in this room are a little bit different. Dare I say, we're all a bit weird. Your average consumer...
What do you do when someone asks you what you do for a job?
I make something up.
Yeah, I'm the same.
I'm kidding. But,
no, and I'm the same. It's like, what do you do? Well, I work in identity. It's like a glazed look over their face. You know?
Correct. They don't know, nor do they care about a private key and none of that. So it has to be extremely convenient. It has to be secure so that there's integrity and bad actors don't come in. But we increasingly need to talk about privacy and what an important role that plays. Because in China, they've solved all this. You have an incredibly convenient solution, WeChat in particular, and it's very secure, but it's zero privacy.
Is WeChat secure?
It depends how you define security, but as far as
I imagine that fraud is rife in WeChat. I don't actually know.
As far as it's working, insofar as what there was before and what it does now, it significantly reduces the risk for businesses as far as that goes.
Okay.
But as far as privacy goes, you almost have none.
No, of course.
So it's a case of whatever the future looks like, it's to agree what these values and principles ought to be so that we can make some progress.
Yeah, okay. Good. So I think we've got a sense of where the problems are. We have a system that's broken, that was designed for an earlier period of time. We know there's lots of friction today. I mean, we all experience this. Anytime you want to do something like, I don't know, get a mortgage or get a new bank account or something. And particularly, I mean, I've got children who've just been through the process or just going through the process of going to university. So exactly the time of life where you have, you experience these things. But and also people coming in, travelling into the UK. That I mean, not personally, but I know from friends that have moved here, they've had great problems. I mean, in fact, I have a friend who's she's British. She then moved to Australia for a couple of years, and then came back, and it's like she had never existed before. It was unbelievable. Even something basic like getting a mobile phone was really, really hard for all the reasons you're talking about. So you obviously both have some great solutions that you're working on. In your case, Hussein, it's very much focused around the mobile and how to use the technology in the mobile to enable that onboarding to work much better for people. And then in your case, Charlie, you have some technology that sits kind of in the background and makes that process of spotting the bad guys much more efficient and will work much more reliably. What are the things that, with your technologies, that are changing? I mean, where are you going with them? What do you think? Is your solution going to be the same in 5 years' time? What are you looking at?
So if I was to categorize what we're doing in two halves, the first has been in the last 7 years, taking your offline identity online and using a government ID and facial biometrics to do so. What we're doing, or how we're doing that, is fundamentally machine learning, whereby we sit in the middle of all these different organizations and businesses. As and when there's an attack or someone's using a fake ID through one client, our machine learning models learn, and then it helps prevent that when that same fraud ring or similar ID is coming through another client. So that has helped make it significantly better over time. We don't catch 100% of the fakes. Out of every 10,000 people that come through, 203, on average, we expect to be fraudulent. We successfully catch 200, and we still miss 3.
Yeah.
So we rely on feedback loops with clients so that they tell us, by the way, you missed this one, and then that's what we use to learn more. So that's what we've done so far. What we've been working on more recently, and what's going to take us to the next more like 10 years, is helping give everyone in the world the ability to own and control their own legal identity, so that they, sort of sitting in the background in a very user-convenient and an almost invisible way, so that they can elect to share that with all the reliant parties or businesses that they want to gain access to.
We'll pick up on that a little bit later, because this idea of putting people in control of their identities is quite an interesting idea, and it's capturing quite a lot of people's imagination, but I've got some questions about it. So we'll come back to that. In terms of Comply Advantage, what are you've got your technology today, what are you thinking about? Where are you going to go with your solutions and your services?
Yeah, so I guess allied to Hussein's like phase 1, phase 2 analogy. So I guess phase 1, what we've built is, so in the old world, you'd have 400 researchers in the room manually compiling information on 6 billion people, and it'd be out of date very, very quickly, right? Whereas what we did, we did that with algorithms, right? So I guess phase 2 is extending that beyond people to companies and building like a kind of knowledge graph of all people and companies in the world, such that you can understand like risk around like the credit, fraud, AML.
Yeah, interesting, because actually one of the things that I encounter a lot is that people often think about, when you talk about identity, they think about individuals, and they forget the fact that companies have identities too. I mean, it's very clear in the AML directives, because it talks about needing to, AML law, it talks about needing to identify companies and particularly look at things like who the beneficial owners are, that kind of thing. But the other thing that is often missed as well is that identity is like a two-way thing, right? The bank might need to know who I am for regulatory purposes, but actually I need to know just as well that the organisation I'm dealing with is reliable and trustworthy as well, particularly if it's some new fintech company that's just emerged and it kind of looks interesting and I want to invest some money with them. How do I know who they are? They're not going to run off with my money, right? So I think there's the idea that the fact that you've kind of got a beachhead, which is a significant beachhead focusing on one particular part of the overall problem, meaning individuals, and from that you're moving out into the broader set of identity needs is quite interesting. I wanted to just talk about this idea of so we used to live in a world when the way that we measured the quality of identity services was kind of straightforward. So you have documents that are designed to meet certain standards, and it was all very kind of sort of predictable, and so you could say, well, okay, you need to have a process, you have a KYC process, and you have to tick these 3 boxes in this particular sequence, and it was very kind of prescriptive, I suppose. When you move to something that's more like machine learning based, then it becomes, the approach of measurement of those things is quite different. You started to touch on this when you talked about the feedback loop. So perhaps you could just talk a bit more about how do you build confidence in a machine learning approach to identification.
Sure. So on the for us, it's specifically government IDs. So if you've seen millions of the UK driving license, for instance, you know the category, the type, the year, you know what normal looks like, and therefore you are good, you can, with a high degree of confidence, when a new one comes through, say this seems genuine. And you have what bad looks like. So if it comes through and it hasn't met the machine learning threshold, we have fraud experts double checking. When they double check, they annotate and process so that we know this pattern here seems fraudulent. We're not always sure because it could have been stained because it was in a washing machine, or it could be a sort of sophisticated fraudster. But if you repeatedly see the same patterns, then the risk profile goes up, and therefore it gives an alert the next time you see it. So if you have almost 200 countries, all passports are standardized, but every country has a different template for a driving license and a different one for a government ID. So soon you have 600 ID types. And to make it even more...
And they change every 3 years.
Exactly. To make it more interesting, you have new versions all the time.
Yeah.
So there are almost 5,000 different types that we cover. And the function of that improving is just the samples that we see in these feedback loops, which is why it's taken 7 years and it's going to continue to take so long. It's going to be never ending. So that's the specific approach. But we rely heavily on partners too. So we are lucky in that our favorite one, and I'm not just saying it because he's here, is ComplyAdvantage.
Right.
So that once we verify the person is who they claim to be, their legal identity is legitimate, we then, clients can choose partners to then do additional checks such as watch list searches and so on.
So you must make use of machine learning within your services.
Yeah, so, I mean, when I was doing Market Invoice, like, I read this, a few books on machine learning, right? And just like basic, like, so we do very different types of machine learning. I mean, I guess the cliche is that it's like teenage sex, and everyone says they're doing it, but very few actually are, right? But like, you know, so Hussein really is doing machine learning, and he's doing computer vision, right?
Yes.
And classification. We're doing, the stuff I like is kind of entity resolution and network analytics on top of that, so kind of a graph of stuff, right? So I guess the kind of, for me, the really fun bit is entity resolution. So as in, like, companies really struggle. Like, Citigroup will have like 70 subsidiaries, none of which are able to share data between each other. And so, like, they haven't got a view of their customer, and then they haven't got a view of all the bad people outside. You know, what we do is, like, partly we'll kind of, we'll crawl like 70 million pages every day and then extract from that entities, and some of them will be bad, some will be good.
Oh, so in effect, you can kind of normalize the data without having to go through a normalization process. What I mean is, if you've got lots of different sources of data that are all described differently with different semantics, your machine learning can go, well, actually, looking at this set of unstructured data, or maybe structured differently data, we can figure out that there's an organization over there and it links to a person over here, without having to kind of do it from the ground up, which would just be an impossible task.
I mean, I think what Hussein and I are trying to do is break new ground with technology, right?
Yeah.
And I think with machine learning, there's an analogy, right? In terms of you can have like interns that you can use machine learning to have 1,000 interns that can work for all day, every day, right? And then do the monotonous tasks, right? That's like phase one, right? Phase two is, I think what we're trying to get to is whereby you have someone who can work for a million hours and then see insights that are only possible at massive scale, whereby it's just so uniquely more powerful than anything a human could do, right? And I think both of us are trying to achieve that, right? I think AI, even though it's like kind of apex of the Gartner Hype Cycle, is like, you know, there is tons of value there, and each day you get like Google, DeepMind, Facebook pumping out papers, right? So you can go in, and I'm sure that's what we do most of the time, is kind of new paper, can I apply this, right? And then you get huge leaps in accuracy and recall, and suddenly the algorithm can do all kinds of cool new things, right? So I think it's really exciting being at the kind of cutting edge of this in terms of you can do, like, you know, every day there's new technologies that you can think and apply, right? And given the cost of computing power is coming down, like, I think, like, given the huge problems that fintechs have, lending companies have, right? Like, the biggest problem they have is KYC, right? If you go and ask any of the audience members, which is your biggest team, right? Probably it's going to be compliance and operations, right? Which is probably also the most difficult and most expensive and most, like, you know, monotonous, right? So I think for us, it's super exciting to be helping these companies solve those problems.
Great. Last few minutes of this session, I wanted to just touch on two things. The first thing is this idea of individuals having much more control of their data or of their identity. And there is, we don't have time to go into it, but there is a whole kind of movement talking about self-sovereign identity, which kind of links into that. How much control is it realistic to expect individuals to take over their identity?
Realistic in the sense that what technology enables can be full control. What consumers have appetite for, what they're interested in is limited. Everything has to be thought through, and essentially what I mean by that is it has to be so intuitive. They're okay with one click. They're okay with, if you say you got one option to proceed as normal, and this might take 60 seconds, you have another option, it might take 5 seconds and it's easier, they will opt in for the easier choice.
Yes.
The vast majority will. So it is, everything has to be prepackaged, easy, already sort of thought through, and basically spoon-fed. When that occurs, then there will be wide adoption.
So who is going to do that packaging and spoon feeding?
So we are partner focused. So we have more than a dozen partners, the most active partners on decentralized or portable identity, and we are convinced that this is the future. So we are assisting and supporting all of those. So we take your physical offline identity online, and then our partners are the ones that are focusing on how to best enable that portability. So there's nowhere near a clear winner yet, but the hope is that they will emerge at some point.
Yeah, okay. The second question I wanted to ask was about, we've talked about the fact that there's a need to do things better, that there are technologies, and you obviously both have companies and technologies that can help address some of those problems. What should the industry be doing? What should banks or financial services organisations be doing to address some of these real pain points that... I must apologise, the Slido thing has only just come on, so all you people have been busily typing questions. I haven't seen them. So apologies for that. So anyway, at least it just came on down here. I don't know how long it's been on up there. So, but anyway, what should the industry be doing?
Working with us.
Well, of course, you know, but apart from the obvious, I mean, should they, I mean, is there something regulatory, something...
So you have, to make this work, in our view, you have technology which already exists and is kind of done. You have partnerships and a willingness to be part of pilots and so on, to just have your organizations learning about the future. And thirdly, you have regulatory engagement to ensure that the policy is keeping up with this. But as far a business model goes, it's to recognize that everything is moving to a decentralized world. P2P lending, fintech, even politics and campaigning. So next is going to be identity.
Great. On that note, I think we'll stop. I hope you'll agree with me. Two great speakers representing companies that are really leading the charge in the digital identity space. Certainly two companies to watch. And let's give them a round of applause. Thanks very much.
Great job.